Well, hello there. Today we discuss the Cold War consensus, or the Cold War and New Deal consensus, or vice versa. You take your pick. You can be creative here. A peak period of bipartisan cooperation. The time period between World War II and, say, roughly the 1970s, so mostly the 50s and 60s, where we're going right now. It was a period in American history that is known for both parties being able to come together and achieve compromises and get things done. That is relative to other times and time periods where this wasn't so much the case. It's not so much the case now in our current state of politics, and it might be fair to say that this period here, the 50s and 60s, is the last time in which you've seen such bipartisan cooperation. That's not to say that both parties or the parties didn't have serious disagreements, ideological differences. Doesn't mean to say they got along well all the time, or that they compromised everything away, all their principles away. It's not. It's just relative to certain times earlier in American history, and since this does stand out, as the quote says. So what do we mean by New Deal and Cold War consensus, or whatever form of that question or statement you want to use? Well, it's quite simple. As you see on the screen, both parties believed they had to largely keep New Deal reforms in place, and on the Democrat side, mostly because they believed in the programs. On the Republican side, not so much. And we start then with a quote from President Eisenhower, who you see in the picture on the right, or to the left, but the guy on the right. In a letter to his brother during his presidency, he said, "Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things, but their number is negligible and they are stupid," unquote. So from Eisenhower's perspective, a Republican president, he's saying, it's not that I love New Deal programs, it's that the populace, the voting public, wouldn't stand for us tampering with or eliminating these programs. It's political suicide. So if for no other reason than to stay alive politically as a party, we have no choice but to support these things. Now that would change to some degree in later decades, though those programs are still with us. They've come under increasing heat and have come under increasing opposition without the party or parties going away because of such criticism. But at the time, I think he was certainly right. In the 50s and 60s, New Deal programs were just new enough to still be popular. People didn't see, any or too many of downsides yet, negatives, and they were just old enough for people to feel like it was, a tradition, something that, if you took it away from them at this point, you're taking away, what belongs to us. There's already kind of a feeling of ownership and familiarity here. So this is a unique period in American political history. Before moving on, remember that we've already covered most of the aspects of American foreign policy during this same time period, the early Cold War. So now we're going back and looking at the same years, but focusing mostly on domestic policy. And there is some overlap, so there are a few items on our agenda that take us back to foreign policy again, but most of this is domestic policy, and through three presidencies. The presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, again in the picture, then the presidency of John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, not in the picture, and then the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, who is in the middle of that picture, also a Democrat. And so these are back-to-back-to-back presidencies. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. So in some ways we're dealing with a unit dealing with these presidents in order. So the hidden hand president, Dwight D. Eisenhower and his administration. A few quotes from Eisenhower gives us some sense of what type of president he was, and I will, of course, use these to make my own comments. But he said at one point, "In war and in peace, I've had no respect for the desk pounder and the loud and slick talker." Eisenhower was a button-down guy, a World War II hero, to put it mildly, and a straightforward sort of a no frills president. And he got a lot of criticism for it, and does even now from some scholars and historians, for being kind of just a caretaker president with no sort of real energy, charisma, etc. But I don't see it that way, and some historians agree. So we'll talk about this more. But what he's saying is that the presidents or leaders that come around and talk, trash, that make a lot of loud noise, can sort of smooth talk you or whatever, don't impress me. I'm impressed with somebody that stays more low key and gets the job done. And guess what? That's exactly what he did. He said, always leave a line of retreat for your antagonist. And this, in a sense, attests to Eisenhower's shrewdness as a politician, his kind of poker face, ability to kind of play poker and not sort of let the other person what your hand looks like, but also to understand the sort of the give and take, the back and forth of politics. He said, "I do not engage in personalities." Similar to the first quote, he thought that the presidency is not so much about personality, at least it shouldn't be, as about competence and hard work and ability. And again, he thought the president should lead by example, but also in an understated way, not having to have the limelight all the time. In fact, not having it most of the time. He said, "I reserve all criticism for the private conference." He didn't believe it did any good. It did harm, actually, and he believed it was unnecessarily cruel, or at least mean-spirited, to criticize subordinates right in front of everybody else. So he's saying, if somebody needs criticism that works on my staff, whether he was, a general in World War II or the president in this period, he's saying, I'll take them aside after everyone else is gone and tell them what they need to do and what I had a problem with, but I won't try to humiliate them or embarrass them in front of everyone else. I put these quotes on here, again, to give us a little bit of a feel for what type of leader he was. But you can probably already tell from just my brief comments that this is a president I have a great deal of respect for, in many ways, not all, a model to me for how a president should behave in office and perform their duties of office. Ike, as his intimates and even the press, the public started to call him, not everyone to his face, but his friends called him that, so a nickname, had an interesting relationship with the press. And members of the press then, journalists then, historians now, are not quite sure still, as well as then, to know what to make of this. One recent book, biography of sorts, a really good one, actually talks about how good of a card player he was in real life. He played both poker and bridge and was a master, and would play for his friends for money regularly, and he'd usually win. And the author of the book I'm alluding to here says that it's no accident that this guy was a great poker player, because he used the same approach to governing as he did in playing cards. Kept, again, his cards close to the vest, and didn't let people know, kind of confused them, and he became known during his presidency for his garbled syntax, meaning in public appearances, you see one on the right there in the photograph, he would just destroy the English language in some ways. The syntax, the sentence structure, the grammatical aspects of what he's saying was often jumbled up and confusing. And again, some scholars, journalists then, and now think it's a sign that he was a simpleton, not that bright of a guy. Others say no, he was playing poker. He was being clever and careful, and he was deliberately making things unclear and vague and muddying the waters when he felt necessary. There was a case, at least one, where I forget what the issue was. He was going out to make a public appearance for the press, and might have been his press secretary. Said, "Hey, Mr. President, what are you going to say if they ask you about this, whatever the hot button issue of the day was?" And he said, "Don't worry, if that comes up, I will just confuse them." And so it does appear to me that he really was using this to his advantage, and so he was deliberately making things difficult to understand. The most famous example of this I have on the text of here, and the picture on the right is that exact press conference. So he's saying those things, these words right there. Somebody asked him a question about nuclear warfare. This is in the 50s, so he was the first president to have to deal with the possibility of large-scale nuclear weapons, and their use. The only thing I know about war was two things. It's already got his verb tense messed up. The only thing I know about war was two things. The most changeable factor in war is human nature in its day-to-day manifestation, but the only unchanging factor about war is human nature. And the next thing is that every war is going to astonish you in the way it occurred and the way it's carried out. So that for a man to predict, particularly if he had the responsibility for making the decision to predict what he's going to use, how he's going to do it, I would think would exhibit his ignorance of war. That's what I believe. So I think you just have to wait, and that's the kind of prayerful decision that may someday face a president. What? What did he just say? So it's possible that he just wasn't a good public speaker, and sort of garbled things up because of his lack of ability. But I seriously doubt it. And those that saw him as a simpleton maybe forgot that he's the guy that defeated Hitler. Now, I'm exaggerating a great deal because it's not just Eisenhower that defeated Hitler, but he was the guy in charge as Supreme Allied Commander of Europe with the entire military effort by the Americans and the British on the Western Front, D-Day, and all of that. So I think he's sometimes underestimated, certainly as a president. He's not underestimated as much as a general. Before moving on, getting into more depth, detail on his presidency, I like to provide some context by giving us a look at American culture, the economy, society in the 1950s. And before we start and get into some detail on the next two Democratic presidents, Kennedy and Johnson, who are very much related to each other, we're going to do some context on the 1960s as well. Cultural, social, economic context there as well. So, and we're not exhausting all aspects of this for reasons of time, but just some of the more salient features here. One of them is the rise of television, something we've been stuck with, or benefited from ever since. And you might say today that, well, television is kind of obsolete. It's not really a big impact on our culture any longer because computers and smartphones, internet, social media has replaced it. But not really, right? Much of what you look at on your phone, if you look at YouTube and other things, a lot of them are clips from television, even now. Or ways to watch TV on those devices, or TV programs on those devices anyway. So it's still a technology that has tremendous influence and has ever since the 1950s. Professor Rourke says by 1960, nearly 90% of American homes boasted a television set, and the average viewer spent more than 5 hours each day in front of the screen. Those numbers probably haven't changed much. If anything, they've gone up since then, which is a bit frightening. I mean, again, I don't mean Americans are spending 5 hours a day today in front of their television set. But if you factor in all the ways that you can look at TV or clips of TV, it still might be something similar to that, if not more. Already in the 50s, the first decade where televisions went into the home in big numbers by the millions, corporate advertising already saw that this was the way to advertise. The 50s, because of television, is kind of the next jump in advertising and public relations. We saw the first big sort of move onto the stage in advertising being in the 1920s. And this is an extension of that because of television. So it became the major vehicle for fostering consumption. So television in some ways appears to be the perfect medium for advertising. There are some studies, and they're contested, but some studies that indicate or claim that when you watch television, your brain goes into kind of a sponge-like state and just sort of absorbs what's sort of coming out of the television screen at you, the sounds, the sights, etc. If that's true, and it may not be, if it's true, then you can see why corporations would see this as perfect. That would be ideal for them. You sitting in front of the TV and things just go into your brain, whether you want them to or not. I think some of this is clearly true. You can just do it with kind of the eyeball test. How many of you, raise your hand, have found yourself all of a sudden humming or whistling an advertising jingle from some ad that you've heard a bunch of times, and you go, wait a minute, I didn't even realize that was in my head. I didn't even mean to sing that. You just find yourself doing so. So there's probably some truth to the idea that it does kind of the techniques plus the technology allow them to insert such things in your head, which is a bit scary. Also, it was already also early on used for political campaigns. The 1952 election, even Dwight D. Eisenhower used TV ads for the first time. I mean, this is the first time any president or candidate had done so. I say even Eisenhower because he was generally opposed to such things, but got talked into it, by his political advisors and handlers who said, if you want to win, you're going to have to do some of this. But I don't think was wild about it. The television in the 50s and beyond came to dominate Americans' leisure time. So it's had a significant impact on our culture ever since, both for good and bad, and we could argue both sides of that. We're not going to for reasons of time. However, already there was criticism even from people involved in television, or at least involved in regulating it in this case. Norman Minnow, chairman of the FCC, or Federal Communications Commission, called television a vast wasteland. A vast wasteland. So even then, there were already cultural critics of television. All these things, slide by slide here, about features of the 1950s are related. The automobile and its impact on American society in this period, right? That has something to do with television as well, especially when you look at the photograph. You see cars parked underneath the Golden Arches, one of the earliest McDonald's. So think about the connection between right, advertising, your car, and fast food, particularly drive-through these days. So these things are very much interconnected. By 1950, there were 40 million plus registered cars. Auto sales in the U.S., you can look at the numbers there yourself, but through about a decade of time, they are skyrocketing and would continue up from there. James Patterson, one of the great historians on this time period in U.S. history, in a book called Grand Expectations, says automobiles hastened the adoption of new patterns of living, also did much to stimulate the remarkable economic growth of the era. So this is the first. We know cars have been around for a while. Henry Ford and the Model T, going back to the beginnings, early part of the 20th century, and the internal combustion engine that long ago. But it's the 50s when America became a car culture. When you see again, everyone owning or wanting to own a car, and American society and culture adapting to and around the automobile. And I think it's also safe to say that it's the 50s where Americans actually fell in love with their cars. We've had kind of a love affair with cars ever since. I think it was in the 50s where that part of our culture started as well. For good and bad. The rise of suburbia is also connected. Suburban developments outside cities and moving further and further outside of cities as they themselves grow basically require cars just to get around in the suburban area because they're spread out more than inner cities are. So you can get by without a car, take buses and that, but it's much more difficult in suburbia today and then than if you lived in the inner city. But you can see from the photograph from the air that the first housing developments, housing tracts show signs of a great deal of uniformity. We can't see them up close, but it does look, and we're probably not wrong in concluding that those houses are like cookie cutter cutouts of the ones next door to it, so that they're all basically the same. And then this is really the first era where there were major suburbs. There had been a few outside of big cities before, like New York, but now they start to happen everywhere, all over the country. A developer named Levitt, he's the one who kind of revolutionized how to do this. And there are a couple of different towns different places named after him. Levittown. This one is on Long Island. You see pictured here, but there were other Levittowns as well. But of course, as always happens in capitalism and business, there are copycats. When somebody sees a guy like Levitt make money developing these housing projects, tract housing, they start businesses doing the same thing. So pretty soon there's great competition and suburban developments and neighborhoods go in all over the country. This was spurred and bolstered by government-guaranteed low-interest mortgages, also by the U.S. government making mortgage interest deductible on your taxes, things which are still basically around today. In some form. So the government was trying to stimulate home buying and home ownership in the country. So was this a positive? Well, it depends on how you look at it or what features of it you look at. It is this rise of suburbia is a big part of the concurrent rise in standard of living for more and more Americans. The working class, workers in factories, during this era, again, most of the 50s and 60s, generally had good jobs. If you worked on, say, the Ford Motor assembly line, you had a good job, you had pretty good pay, you had good benefits, and the company, as long as you did your job and didn't make trouble, they pretty much stuck by you. American corporations had kind of a tacit agreement with labor unions. That would be the case. Your guys don't go on strike, and we'll pay them well and make sure that they have, they're taken care of and their families kind of into even retirement age. And so this goes along with such workers being able to afford to buy homes, sometimes for the first time in the family's history. So we talk about how each generation of Americans wanted to do better than their parents and often did. This is sort of the suburban homes that they start to buy by the millions is a feature of this. But of course there's a downside as well, which is already on the screen, and this is what became known as white flight. As Professor Rourke says, the suburbs did help polarize society, especially along racial lines. Suburban America was dramatically segregated. So this is for a couple reasons. One is because there are so many people of color in the inner cities still mired in poverty at that time. It was generally more affluent whites that were able to move out, and move to the suburbs. Why would you want to move out to the suburbs? Well, you get away from the congestion and overcrowding and traffic, whatever else. You have a nice green lawn in your front and backyard that you might not have had if you lived in New York City or Boston or Chicago in an apartment somewhere. So this is why many of us buy suburban homes or in suburban areas today. So that's part of it. The white people in general moving out of the inner city could afford to. But the really, I think, nasty side of this is that when African American families, Hispanic families did try to move to these because some could afford to do so, they were discriminated against. Sometimes in really, really obvious ways and blunt ways. So sometimes in more subtle ways. But they were one way or the other made to feel clearly that they weren't welcome because they weren't for the most part. So a great deal of racism is sort of part of the rise of suburbia and what's again called white flight. So that's not to say no, people of color lived in these neighborhoods, but they did so clearly, feeling that they weren't welcome because in many ways they were not. The growth of consumerism is a big part of the 50s and 60s as well. It's not that it's new here, but it kind of takes on a new, takes itself to a new level. This era is sometimes called the golden age of capitalism by historians and economists, because it's during this period that America sees its biggest year-to-year economic growth rates of all time, before or since. We've never had growth of GDP, from one year to the next as big as then, and so consumerism became a central feature of American society and has been ever since. In some ways, consumerism is actually a value in American society today. Again, both for good and bad, or good or bad, depending on your perspective. Almost every family had a television. Most owned at least one car. By the end of this period, the number of shopping centers in the 50s alone quadrupled. Or a 5-year period between the end of one decade and the middle of the next. I'm sorry. But consumption became a reigning value. Rourke's way of saying it. And back to Patterson again, who says by the late 50s, millions of Americans were enjoying the bounties of affluence and the consumer culture, the likes of which they had scarcely imagined before. So this is something we can relate to because our society has been consumer-oriented ever since. It really wasn't so much before this, even though, of course, we all know industrial society was already there, mass-produced goods, but this really takes on certainly a qualitative difference. One might even argue that there's a quantitative or a qualitative difference here as well. A number of books written during this period, however, do show signs, or at least make claims, that things weren't necessarily great in all ways in the golden age of capitalism during that period. Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963, basically looked at women in suburban America, mainly housewives and kind of middle class or working class families in these suburban areas, and found that women were unhappy. Most of the research she did, door-to-door and interviews kind of thing, she did in the 50s. Book was published in 1963, but either way, it's still during our era. She called this the problem that has no name. That women didn't have a vocabulary. I don't mean the women didn't have a vocabulary, but there wasn't a vocabulary yet to sort of talk about women's issues, in this sense. So she said the problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the U.S. Each suburban housewife struggled with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, she was afraid to ask, even of herself, the silent question, is this all? What does that mean? It means that what she found, anyway, Friedan, is that the majority of housewives were unhappy. And they're basically saying, is this all there is to life? Okay, we have a nice car, we have a nice home, we have a nice family, we have a nice big backyard, but is that it? Because I'm not really feeling fulfilled here. So was that really true by and large, of most American women in suburban America in the 50s? It's hard to know. I wouldn't say that this should be discounted by any means. And by the way, this became a gigantic influence in terms of intellectual influence. Friedan became seen as one of the founders of the modern feminist movement that kind of comes out about 10 years after this in the 1970s, even a bit in the 1960s as well. But so she may have something here, may have been onto something, but it's a bit hard. It's a bit hard to know that for sure. David Reisman in The Lonely Crowd, William H. White in The Organization Man. I'm going to kind of skip through these, but they both talked about how, in different ways, that the golden age of capitalism was actually in many ways kind of crushing workers sort of beneath them. That it was kind of taking, in a sense, it was kind of soul destroying. That it turned workers kind of into automatons, and so it's pretty critical of the capitalist culture of the 1950s, the business culture of the 1950s. Now we get to the Beat generation, the Beat poets, as they were known, although not all of them were poets. These were kind of the counterculture folks of the 1950s. We'll get to the counterculture of the 1960s, which is more famous, but the Beat generation kind of laid down the sort of the model for how to drop out of society, for how to sort of go against mainstream culture. On the left, you see Allen Ginsberg, whose famous poem "Howl" in some ways became kind of the anthem of the Beat generation. Jack Kerouac, wrote a classic book, On the Road. On the right, I say classic in the sense that it became wildly popular over time, in many ways still is. And the Beat generation, as Rourke says, rejected nearly everything in mainstream culture: patriotism, consumerism, technology, conventional family life, discipline. They celebrated spontaneity and absolute personal freedom. And that's putting it mildly. These people lived lives that were about sort of violating the norms of society and sort of living life their own way. And as sort of everything about these kind of events, this cuts both ways, or you can see it in different ways. So I'm saying at every step of the way in this class, I've tried to sort of see things on different sides, because history, as we know, is contested ground. Doesn't mean there's not a right or wrong answer, but I'm giving you different types of possible answers. So on one side, you might say, well, these guys correctly identified the problems in mainstream American culture that they believed were basically unsolvable, and kind of dropped out of that culture, but nonetheless still identified, diagnosed a genuine and serious problem, serious defects that they are pointing out through their work and through their lives in American society. Another way to look at them would be to say these people are whiners, complainers, that they're irresponsible, that they somehow lacked the discipline. They're against discipline overall. Sort of they're not really kind of the success stories, and don't have the values that success is predicated upon. So, and there are studies, authors, intellectuals who have written sort of on both sides of this. So what do we make of the Beat generation? Once in a while I'll give you my take on it, but I'm going to leave that one to you. So now, once we've finished with looking at some contextual features of the 1950s, let's get back to the Eisenhower administration. sometimes referred to as the middle way. In fact, Eisenhower used the phrase the middle way. We should remember that President Eisenhower, before he ran for the presidency, had never voted. He'd never belonged to a political party. He had been a lifetime soldier. He'd been in the Army through his entire career, and he believed that since soldiers, especially officers and higher-ranking ones at that, have to, if they stay in the service, they have to serve both Republican and Democratic presidents, right? And they're supposed to serve loyally. So he believed that he could sort of maintain his ability to do so if he kind of stayed above the fray and didn't become one-sided or the other in American politics. So he wasn't a member of either party. And to show how popular he was in American society as a returning war hero at the end of World War II, when the election of 1952, when he ran for president, was being sort of contemplated, both political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, approached Eisenhower to be their candidate for president. So both sides are trying to enlist him because they knew he hadn't belonged to a political party. He eventually chose to run and register as a Republican. He later said that he would have never done anything else if for no other reason than that his whole family was Republicans, and that his whole city, Abilene, Kansas town, was overwhelmingly Republican. So he had that background, and he wouldn't have betrayed it. Nonetheless, his middle way, I think we can understand partly because of this background. He was a moderate Republican, not an ideological type politically. So he believed in compromise. Part of the reason that this era is known for compromise, right? I mean, the bigger, larger reasons are the imperatives of the New Deal and the imperatives of the Cold War. But it also has something to do with the leadership, and I think especially in Eisenhower's case. Eisenhower was a middle-of-the-road Republican who could and did reach across the aisle to the other side to bring about compromise. In our era today, I think we tend to look down on compromise, partly because we're so polarized and we take one side vociferously and staunchly and lash out at the other, and vice versa. But I don't necessarily get things done in a democracy. It requires somebody or the system as a whole to come together and find areas of cooperation and room to the need to compromise at times. In democratic politics, I believe you shouldn't expect to get everything, because you have other Americans that don't agree with you, and you're going to need to take their desires and their votes into consideration as well if you want to get anything done. So there's really usually not that much option but to seek some form of compromise. Eisenhower, as the quotes here show, understood the contradiction in the dual role of chief of state and prime minister. We'll get back to that. And knew how to blend the two, operating on the assumption that a president who is predominantly viewed in terms of his political prowess will lose public support by not appearing to be a proper chief of state or head of state. That he went to great lengths to conceal the political side of his leadership. This has been written about by a lot of others as well. Here by a guy named Fred Greenstein, The Hidden Hand Presidency. But the American president's job in some ways is two jobs in one. In Europe, in European usually multi-party democracies, they split what our president does in one job into two. The head of state or chief of state is usually the president, and the guy that runs the government every day is the prime minister or chancellor, etc. And what the chief of state does, head of state, is make the statements, make the speeches, make the public appearances, and put sort of a face on the the government publicly espouse its ideals, bring the nation together, right? Play a unifying role with his words and his bearing, handling himself with dignity, etc. And it's the prime minister that does kind of the more nitty-gritty policy work every day. And Eisenhower, according to the author here, Greenstein, seems to have understood the need to do both, and that he sort of took it in his own direction, basically believing that he needed to appear to be the chief of state to the public, like almost all the time, and do the prime minister stuff, the politicking and the policy stuff behind the scenes more quietly. And so then he would look like kind of uniter-in-chief, 24/7. The same author says that he understood the need for presidential silence, and that he had a kind of colorless administrative focus in his presidency that led critics to accuse him of lacking a vision. So here we get back to the back and forth give and take about in assessing his presidency. In some ways, he did lack a vision. He was a more straightforward, kind of down-to-earth president, and didn't believe the president's job should be one of being kind of a rock star, being out into the public eye all the time. Sort of led more quietly, and was accused of not only lacking a vision but being kind of a caretaker president. And he's just kind of even if caretaker's not a full compliment, it's not a full criticism either, because a caretaker, if they do their job as such, you're at least saying, well, they took care of the country until they handed off the baton to the next person who might have had a vision that they didn't. So at the very least, it's still saying that the person did bridge a gap and keep the country alive, and relatively well off, or wouldn't be called a caretaker in the first place. So Eisenhower didn't, I think, believe in presidential vision, and so it might actually be right or fair to call him a caretaker. But considering the dangers that the world posed at this point, post-World War II, during the Cold War, beginning of the Cold War, sort of holding on to sort of a caretaker role and being a genuine, genuinely effective steward as caretaker, I actually think is a pretty decent compliment. So Eisenhower's middle way speeches and articles consistently promoted a bright centrist line between concentrations of unbridled private power, meaning corporate power, on one side of the road, and unlimited state power on the other. Eisenhower viewed the march of American history as a struggle to stay the middle course. So not only was he moderate in the sense that he, was a moderate Republican and sort of middle of the road on the political spectrum, but also with regard to how much power the government should have vis-a-vis the private sector. He kind of straddled that line as well. And I think he did it well, and I think that it's more presidents should aspire to do things the way he did. But that part's my own view. One of the things Eisenhower was most proud of during his presidency was ending the Korean War. We talked about it in our last unit, and the war started with President Truman in power. The war was basically brought to him when North Korea invaded South in 1950. Nonetheless, when Truman left office, the war was still raging, and Eisenhower gets into office, and fairly early on in his presidency, he actually goes to Korea. You can see the photograph on the right, and basically makes peace terms and ends the war. H.W. Brands, very good historian, writes many books, says shortly after the election he redeemed his campaign promise and flew to Korea. His presence in the zone of operations did nothing by itself to break the stalemate, yet it signaled Eisenhower's seriousness about bringing the conflict to an end. And it wasn't just Eisenhower that brought it to an end, but a guy with his stature, president and the general in the U.S. In World War II. This is saying something when he steps in and uses his power and his name recognition and reputation to end the war. Although President Truman, in retirement, said something to the effect of, "I would have been crucified for that peace." And this is the party element in the Korean War. Remember that the Republicans were constantly criticizing the Democrats for being soft on communism, going back to McCarthyism, and which is still around, of course, here. I mean, 1953 is right when McCarthy was at the height of his powers. So what Truman is saying is, as a Democrat, if I would have tried to make a peace treaty, meaning sort of compromising with the Chinese communists, who we've been fighting this war primarily against, right? I would have been accused of being a communist or soft on communism or whatever. But Eisenhower gets in power as president, and as a Republican and as a war hero from World War II, he can get away with it without being. He can make the same deal with that I would have with the Chinese communists, Mao's government, and he won't get criticized because he's a Republican. And I think there's certainly some truth to that. Nonetheless, Eisenhower was proud of this, ending the war, and I do think he should be credited for doing so. The war was kind of sputtering, going nowhere, and getting lots of people killed by this time, certainly unnecessarily, if not even before. Evan Thomas, in a book about Eisenhower, says at the end of the year he would rate ending the Korean War as his greatest accomplishment thus far as president. But it may be true that he considered it, even after he was done in the White House 8 years later, his greatest accomplishment. The interstate highway system from the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which you see here, created the highway system that we know today. And you can see from this map on the upper left, as simple as it is, that those are the major interstates, federal highway system that was created starting in 1956, although it took 35 years to build completely. But this is a massive government project, to put it simply. But you can see in California, right, where sort of the cross comes together, those are both two freeways, highways we're very familiar with. I-5 going north to south, and I-80 going west to east. So we have these highways right here, with us today. The interstate highways, as H.W. Brands writes, facilitated the emergence of the mass culture of the middle class. McDonald's and other chain restaurants sprang up along the interstates, making every city and town look and taste increasingly like every other. So he is Brands injecting a negative in there that this is intended to homogenize America. And we see this today. You try to travel these freeways, and you see a McDonald's every 5 miles, a Carl's Jr., what have you. And so this is part and parcel of what happens. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 is interesting as a gigantic government project because, in general, President Eisenhower was averse to spending or overspending, and especially deficit spending. He liked a balanced budget. He didn't like the idea of the country going into debt or too much debt. But he wasn't, as I told you before, heavily ideological. He wasn't an ideologue. An ideologue is someone that's so ideological they're just driven by that, and they tend not to, or they don't ever compromise their ideology. It's very one-sided and they never move. But I told you Eisenhower wasn't like that. So wait a minute. So if he doesn't like debt or government spending, getting into debt, then why would he push something and support it and sign it into law after it passes Congress that did exactly that? Because Eisenhower was open-minded. He was flexible, the middle way. Willing to compromise. So what you can hear him saying here, I said it this way as far as I know, is generally speaking, I am against government debt and projects done by the government that are so big it puts greatly in debt. But this one is necessary. There are exceptions to to every rule, and this is an exception. This is something we need to do regardless of my own political philosophy, my own uncomfortableness with debt. This is something important for the country. I think one of the reasons, though not the only, this is true of him, is as a military man, he saw that the highway system would be of strategic value for the military, being able to move troops and weapons and vehicles on the ground much more easily because of this. And as you already, I'm sure can see that the federal highway system itself helps to connect the suburban areas and suburban areas to inner cities, and so there's a mutually reinforcing relationship between the federal highway system increasing over time and suburbia increasing over time. So there's more and more freedom of movement now that everyone has a car, or almost everyone, right? And more and more roads, highways, freeways. So that connects back to the automobile as well. But there's also a certain element of isolation in this as well, which is certainly paradoxical. I'm not going to get into it, but it's certainly worth thinking about. In what ways could this be, all of these things be isolating to individuals when in fact it's connecting them more, providing the ability to connect more? You can ponder that question. Eisenhower, though he presided over a government that had the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. There were only 2 countries that had them at all at that point, but had to, devise military strategy, an American national defense policy with, nuclear weapons in the equation. But he appears to have genuinely not liked nuclear weapons, as many of us don't, but that he was horrified by the prospect of a nuclear war. And remember, this is a former general who had fought in the bloodiest war in all of human history. So I think he had a kind of a unique perspective on the suffering and mass suffering that takes place in large wars, and that if we have a world war, a nuclear war, it's going to be even greater suffering. So his ideas and policies throughout his presidency, I think, sort of bear this out. In his Atoms for Peace speech and proposal that he made in front of the United Nations General Assembly in 1953, so early in his presidency, he basically is trying to convince the Soviets and American citizens and leaders that we should sort of embrace nuclear energy and move the science in that direction and the expenditures in that direction and move it away increasingly from nuclear weapons. Now, of course, the Soviet Union would have to go along with this as well, or it couldn't be done because the United States couldn't afford to let the Soviets have a nuclear weapons program running rampant while the United States converts all of its nuclear energies into nuclear energy. So not enough to take this weapon out of the hands of soldiers. It must be put, or it's not enough, it must be put into the hands of those who will know how to adapt it to the arts of peace. These are his own words. This greatest of destructive forces can be developed into a great boon for the benefit of all mankind. Now, cynics, critics have pointed out, and there's certainly some truth to this, that he must have known, his administration must have known, that the Soviet Union was never going to go for this. So it can be seen, and critics have seen it as this is just a way for Eisenhower and the U.S. to sort of look like it's doing the right thing, to look noble, knowing they never have to follow through on it because the Soviets wouldn't go for it, which of course ended up being true. Nonetheless, if you read enough about Eisenhower as a person, his presidency, I do think it's hard to come away with without the conclusion that this guy really did loathe the possibility of having to go to nuclear war, and wanted to do whatever he could to at least reduce nuclear arsenals, if not sort of turn it around and get rid of it entirely. Another example of this, to me, showing that this is on his mind a lot. 2 years later, the Open Skies speech and proposal coming in Geneva, Switzerland, at a summit meeting there, the major world powers. And this one is even more radical and more far-reaching, though the same criticism was levied that he knew the Soviets wouldn't go along, and so it just makes the United States look good without any risk of having to follow through. He said this is to give each other, meaning we and the Soviets, a complete blueprint of our military establishments from beginning to end, from one end of the country, one of our countries to the other, to provide within our countries facilities for aerial photography to the other country. What? What is he saying? He's saying that in the interest of sort of keeping the world safe from a nuclear war, so that one side doesn't become so fearful of what the other side's hiding in terms of nuclear weapons, let's just allow each other to openly inspect and fly over and take pictures, whatever, of each other's nuclear arsenals, and that way fear and lack of knowledge won't drive us into an unwanted and disastrous nuclear war. It's quite radical, and again, it may have been cynical in a way for the United States to look good, and Eisenhower may have been aware of that, motivated by that, but I still think it's hard to come away without some belief that he actually really meant this, as little of a chance as it had to succeed. Stephen Ambrose, one of his biographers, said Geneva produced an intangible but real spirit that was felt and appreciated around the world. So whatever his actual intentions for making this proposal, it did bring a lot of sort of goodwill, not just in the U.S., but Western Europe, for instance. The publics there tended to pick this up with sort of great optimism and glee. But as I said, Eisenhower did have to craft a nuclear strategy as part of his military strategy and part of American foreign policy, and in this regard, he had the assistance of his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. You see pictured with him and pictured by himself in the upper left. Dulles as Secretary of State, this Secretary of State's job is foreign policy, so he helped to craft New Look, as it was called, Eisenhower policy, and massive retaliation, the more specific approach to nuclear weapons. Eisenhower does appear to have been playing coy with the Soviet Union here, another kind of example of his tendency to kind of play poker in the way he did politics. Eisenhower, we know, was good at confusing people by making statements that were hard to understand. What did he just say? And he did it sort of again here when it came to the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons, etc., etc. While at the same time, his Secretary of State Dulles was making much more clear statements on this, and pretty aggressive ones. So it appears that this was deliberate to keep the Soviets off guard. Listening to the president and saying, I don't know what he is saying, what his stance is, and we're listening to Dulles, his Secretary of State, and we do know what his stance is, and it's a hardcore, we'll use nuclear weapons if we have to, so look out statement. So the administration in the end believed that the way to deter aggression is for the free community to be willing and able to respond vigorously at places and with means of its own choosing. John Foster Dulles himself then says, now the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff can shape our military establishment to fit what is our policy, instead of having to try to be ready to meet the enemy's many choices. That permits a selection of military means instead of multiplication of means. As a result, it is now possible to get and share more basic security at less cost. This is really, in part, saying that the Eisenhower administration is going to rely heavily on nuclear weapons as part of our strategic defense, which seems to contradict what I just said about him being against nuclear weapons. But Eisenhower was in some ways, it appears bluffing with the Soviet Union, and that his way of not fighting a war, his way of preventing, as best he could, the U.S. ever getting into a nuclear exchange was to, in a sense, bluff the Soviet Union into kind of backing down and letting the Soviet Union know, massive retaliation, that if you hit the button and launch a nuclear strike on us, we'll unload on you in return. So you'll destroy our society, but we'll destroy yours, and they'll cancel each other out. And if that's true, that it's not, he didn't want nuclear war, but he used that strategy as a way to keep nuclear war from happening. It's certainly a risky strategy. It's also true, and Dulles' quote there shows it, that nuclear weapons are cheaper than huge armies and tanks and aircraft carriers and jet planes, etc. So in a sense, he was trying to cut the budget, or keep the budget for military things under sort of reasonable limits. The Suez Crisis and the U.S. in the Middle East and Europe. Here's where we get to foreign policy a bit. But this shows us one of the major crisis moments during Eisenhower's presidency, and also says something about his presidential leadership and how things were different then than they are now. H.W. Brands says about the crisis, Eisenhower could scarcely believe their folly. He means the British, the French, and the Israelis, all allies of the U.S. The imperialist days were over, Eisenhower judged, and this sort of action risked turning the entire Third World, those days that was the name for the poorer countries of the world, against the West. He responded at once with an ultimatum that stopped the Suez War in its tracks, humiliated the British, and made the American president a momentary hero in the Third World, even in the Middle East. What had happened is that the leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who in many ways was a good leader, skillful, the Middle Eastern world sort of rallied around his leadership because he was doing an effective job, kind of playing between both sides, the Soviet communists and the Americans and British on the other, to kind of get better deals and better, arrangements politically for Egypt. But the United States got tired of him sort of doing this and started to distance themselves from him. And he, among other things, that caused controversy, Nasser, that is, decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, meaning Egyptian forces are going to take control of the canal. Now, we should know from previous units, particularly the one on anyone on American sort of empire and foreign policy, that the Suez Canal, or the Panama Canal, these are strategic resources, strategic points that are usually defended with great earnest by powers that rely on the use of such things. So when Nasser threatened to and started to nationalize the canal, which means Egypt's going to take it over, hadn't been ever taken by Egypt, though it was in Egypt before. It had been in the hands of the British and the French, at least the canal zone. The British government, the French government, and the Israeli together concocted a plan and put into operation where they sent troops to retake the canal zone without informing the United States at all. Eisenhower had to find this out after it had already started. And again, he was furious about it and put his foot down and said, no. We're the big boy in NATO and in the alliance system, fighting against Soviet communism, and we're not in favor of doing this, so you're going to back out. And the British and French and the Israelis had no choice but to back away. So you can see how this would make the U.S. and the Eisenhower administration, at least for the time being, look like the good guys, at least relative to the other countries, in the eyes of the Third World as a whole, and the Middle East more specifically. we have no enemies on the moon. Another major series of events during Eisenhower's 8 years in office, he was reelected in 1956, was the Soviet move into space through the Sputnik program. So it was 1957 that the Soviets put the first rocket into outer space. They got to space before the Americans did, which caused panic, fear, humiliation, embarrassment on the part of American leaders, American scientists. How could the Soviets beat us to space? This was, in some ways, an arrogant and ethnocentric view of things, since it sort of implies that the Soviets are kind of inferior to us. How could they possibly have done this? Nonetheless, it happened, and the United States had to respond, and they certainly did, with all kinds of legislation and all kinds of changes in order to overall try to catch up with and surpass the Soviet Union in regards to a space program. But Eisenhower wasn't totally sold on it. He really had no choice. He said at one point, "We have no enemies on the moon. So why are we spending so much money on exploring outer space and the moon when we can and need spending on things right here that he deemed to be of greater importance?" Nonetheless, he might have been wrong about that, of course, and nonetheless he couldn't stop it anyway. So, for instance, in light of the response to Sputnik, the National Defense Education Act was passed in 1958, which was over $1 billion to improve science curricula throughout the country, mainly in the universities, but to some degree at lower levels as well. This is unprecedented U.S. government involvement in the schools. What does this have to do with the Soviets sending a rocket into outer space? Well, the idea is we need to get more educated and gifted scientists into place in the next generation and beyond to make good on our being defeated in the first round of this. This also led to the creation of NASA to promote missile development and space exploration both. So it was Sputnik that spurred NASA into being created. So Eisenhower supported all these programs and laws and signed them into law, but he just hadn't been wild about doing so. But he understood, I think, the need and the politics behind it as well. Sputnik also led to DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, and this was R&D in science and technology, particularly missile defense, nuclear test detection, and other things, some of which have entered our mainstream economy today. NavSat, which was the predecessor to GPS. So the internet really was a DARPA project as well. This is something that we don't learn about too much in history, but it's totally true, and it's true throughout history. Long ago, in all around the world, that it's what so often happens is that we get technologies that are beneficial to us, in many ways beneficial to us, like GPS, like the internet, partly because there's a military need for such technology, and that comes first. So that GPS wasn't created so that you could, go on your smartphone and find where the nearest Home Depot is. That's not why it was created. It was created for military purposes. You think it might be of some little value for you to be able to know exactly where the enemy's position is through GPS? Yeah, kind of important. So that these things were so important that the federal government, put massive amounts of dollars into research to develop these technologies, to put them to military use, and only after the fact are they then do they spill over or given over to the private sector, so private companies can use them to find some application for them, in the consumer economy. And so so many things in history have been invented that ended up being consumer products of great use, of great usefulness, that started as a military necessity. In Eisenhower's last days in office, or last full year in office, came the U-2 spy plane incident, maybe the most humiliating aspect to his presidency and sort of the last big event. So he didn't go out on a great note. The U-2 spy plane was a high altitude plane that could take high resolution pictures. You can see it in the lower right, without being detected most of the time. It wasn't impossible to detect, but it was difficult to detect. And this was, we saw in the last unit, the plane that saw and took pictures of Soviet missiles in Cuba, starting the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the spy planes flights over the Soviet Union had been going on for a while, but they were done by the CIA, and each individual flight had to be signed off on by the president himself. It wasn't just, okay, you get 15 flights for a year, 2 years, and then Congress will sort of look at it again then. No. For any flight over the Soviet Union to take pictures, you needed the president's signature. And he had done it one too many times in his view, and he canceled it and said, "No, we're not doing this. It's too risky. Everybody knows that everybody else is spying. They know we're spying on them. We know they're spying on us. But if we get caught, it's going to make us look really bad because we're, of course, telling the world and the public that we're not spying on them. And it'll be, the Soviet Union can use this to their advantage if this happens." So he canceled it. And the CIA came back to him after it was already canceled and said, "Hey, we need one more flyover. We need one more, I forget why. We need one more set of pictures from the U-2. And he didn't want to do it, and reluctantly, and finally said, "Oh, okay, but this is it. This is the last one." And sure enough, that's the one that got shot down, which is the way life often works. So on May 1st, 1960, the plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers, 1,300 miles inside Soviet territory, was shot down. And this did indeed make the U.S. and Eisenhower look particularly bad. Just before a summit meeting in Paris that included the Soviet Union there. And Khrushchev, the Soviet leader by that time, certainly did use it as a way to sort of beat the United States and make them look hypocritical, partly by fooling the U.S. and the Eisenhower administration. The Americans publicly stated that it was a weather plane that had sort of drifted off course without realizing it, so it was totally innocent mistake. But the Soviets already knew better because they had the plane intact and they had the pilot alive. So once the United States issued this lie, then the Soviets came out with what really happened, and there was egg on America's face. The U-2 incident, as James Patterson says, set in motion a hardening of Soviet-American relations that intensified over the next few years. So this did have some negative effect. Not that relations had been good before, but they were in some ways worse and harder for the U.S. For a number of years, if not more.